A pollen grain does not travel far on its own. Carried by wind, it settles within kilometers of the plant that made it. So when scientists extracted sediment cores from a dry lake bed in what is now the central Sahara and found the fossilized pollen of fig trees, papyrus reeds and grasses that today grow only in sub-Saharan Africa, the implication was not subtle. This was not contamination. This was a record. The largest hot desert on Earth was not so long ago green, and the question that follows is not whether that world existed. It is what and who it held and whether either disappeared completely. Tonight we follow the Sahara's hidden memory across 3 traces. The first runs underground through buried rivers and vanished lakes that satellites are only now learning to read. The second moves across stone carvings, circles and alignments made by people who understood the sky before they had words for what they were doing. The third lives in spoken language in the oral traditions of communities who never stop describing a landscape that no longer exists around them. We will not resolve what these traces mean when placed together. That is not what this space is for, but we will follow them as carefully as the evidence allows. The Sahara today covers roughly 9 million square kilometers from the Atlantic coast of Mauritania to the western edge of the Red Sea. It is by most measures among the most inhospitable landscapes on the planet. Ground temperatures can exceed 70 degrees Celsius. Annual rainfall in the central regions averages below 5 millimeters. The air is dry enough to desiccate stone. And yet, and this detail is worth sitting with beneath that surface in layers of compressed sediments, scientists have found the remains of freshwater snails, fish, vertebrae, hippopotamus bone, and the root structures of trees that require standing water to survive. Not traces of a brief wet season, evidence of centuries of sustained abundance. The mechanism behind this transformation is well understood, and it is worth naming clearly Milankovitch cycles. Subtle long-period shifts in Earth's axial tilt and orbital geometry alter how sunlight is distributed across the planet's surface. Approximately every 20,000 years these shifts intensify, summer heating in the northern hemisphere, enough to draw the West African monsoon northward deep into what is now desert. The last time this happened, the interval that geologists call the African humid period ran from roughly 14,000 years ago to approximately 5,000 years ago. For nearly 9 millennia the Sahara received rain, and where rain fell, leaf followed in forms that left traces we are still learning to interpret. What those traces suggest is at minimum a landscape dense with human presence. Archaeological surveyors across Algeria, Niger, Chad, Libya and Egypt have recovered stone tools of considerable craft ceramic fragments decorated with geometric patterns grinding stones, hearths arranged with evident intention, and burial sites where the dead were placed with apparent care. At Gobro in Niger, a site that was 10,000 years ago, the shore of a freshwater lake excavators found dozens of graves. In one of them, a woman and 2 children were interred together, their bodies positioned so that their hands nearly touched. Preserved pollen in the surrounding sediment suggests flowers were placed with them. The detail is small, it refuses to go away. Some of what the Sahara's green period produced was more deliberate still. In the far southwest of Egypt, on a flat expanse that was once a seasonal lake, there is a site called Nabta Playa. The stones there, rough, unshaped, modest in scale, were arranged sometime around 7,000 years ago, into a circle whose alignments, when tested against astronomical data, correspond to the summer solstice horizon of that era. Not approximately, accurately. The people who built it were not documenting a curiosity. The summer solstice in this region marked the onset of the monsoon rains, the event on which survival depended. Whatever Nabta Playa was calendar ritual space gathering point, it encodes a relationship between observation and necessity that we would later recognize in the temples of the Nile Valley several thousand years downstream. That connection between the Sahara's pastoral cultures and the emergence of Egyptian civilization is one of the more compelling patterns the evidence keeps returning to. It has not been proven in the strict sense. The migration was gradual, spanning centuries, not a single event. But the genetic record, the ceramic typology, the persistence of cattle symbolism across both cultures, the shared fascination with celestial alignment, they do not contradict the pattern. Some researchers argue the Nile civilization was not created by those who arrived from the drying desert, it was seeded by them. That argument deserves weight. It also deserves care. Because underneath the compelling pattern a skeptic's question persists. And it is a fair one. What we have across most of the Sahara's buried record is not cities, not systems of governance, not writing. What we have are communities organised, adaptive, capable of long-distance exchange and sustained observation, but communities nonetheless. The word civilization carries assumptions that the evidence may not yet fully support. The distinction matters, not to diminish what these people built and understood, but to hold the record honestly. A pollen grain is not a palace. A burial with flowers is not a dynasty. And yet the distance between the two may be shorter than the sand that separates them. We follow the first trace now underground into the buried rivers of the Sahara, the ghost channels that once connected the heart of Africa to the sea. The world before the sand. Every 21,000 years, approximately, the Earth completes one full wobble on its axis. Not a dramatic tilt, nothing you would feel standing on the surface, nothing that would register in a human lifetime, or even across a dozen generations. A slow procession, a shift measured in fractions of degrees across millennia. The kind of motion that becomes legible only in what it leaves behind in sediment cores pulled from lake beds, in the chemical signatures of ice layers drilled from Greenland, in the oxygen isotope ratios, preserved inside the shells of creatures that died before writing existed. It is the mechanism behind one of the more quietly disquieting facts in climate science. The Sahara has been green before, not once, repeatedly. At predictable intervals across millions of years, the largest hot desert on the planet has filled with water, grown forests, sustained large animal populations, and then when the orbital geometry completed its long swing, dried again into the landscape we recognize today. The interval we are concerned with tonight ended approximately 5,000 years ago. It had been building for nearly 9,000 years, before that point accumulating slowly from an initial shift in the distribution of summer sunlight across the northern hemisphere. During those 9 millennia, the West African monsoon, driven northward by intensified thermal gradients, penetrated deep into what is now the Central Sahara. Lakes formed where there is currently nothing but gravel salt crust and compacted dust. Rivers carved channels that remain visible from orbit to this day, though. No water has moved through them in 5,000 years. Animals that today require the grasslands of sub-Saharan Africa, elephants, giraffes, hippopotamuses, crocodiles, freshwater fish, ranged freely across landscapes that are now classified among the most extreme arid zones on Earth. The fossil record documents their presence without ambiguity. Hippo bone does not travel far from the water that sustained the animal, and people were there. This is the fact that the rest of this episode is built around, and it is worth stating plainly before the complexity accumulates. People lived in the Green Sahara for thousands of years in communities whose size and sophistication we are only beginning to estimate. They were not passing through on their way to somewhere else, not seasonal visitors following temporary water. They were building, herding, fishing, painting on some stone, burying their dead with evident care, in at least one documented location arranging large stones into configurations that track the movements of the sun with an accuracy that remains measurable today, 7 millennia later. What they built or what they understood about the world they inhabited, and what happened to all of it. When the rains finally withdrew, these are the questions this episode follows without claiming to resolve. The geography deserves a moment of attention because scale shapes everything that follows. The Sahara in its current form covers roughly 9 million square kilometers in area, larger than the continental United States, stretching from the Atlantic coast in the west to the Red Sea hills in the east, from the Mediterranean littoral in the north to the Sahel's transitional scrubland in the south. That southern boundary, the approximate limit of where the monsoon currently reaches, sits today at roughly 15 degrees north latitude. During the African humid period, the same boundary was displaced several hundred kilometers further north, with the monsoon pushing past 20 degrees and perhaps beyond in its wettest phases. The transformation this produced was not uniform. Across the entire desert, the Sahara, during its green period, was a mosaic of dense wetlands in the lower basins, open savanna, across the upland plateaus and arid corridors persisting between wetter zones. But the overall character of the landscape was fundamentally different from anything alive today. The Sahara was by any functional measure a place where sustained human habitation was not only possible but probable. What makes the disappearance of that world particularly difficult to trace is that it did not happen quickly. The transition from green to dry unfolded over centuries with oscillations that would have made the overall trend nearly invisible to any single generation living through it. Lakes that had been permanent became seasonal. Rivers that had run year-round began to fail in summer, then in spring, then altogether. The distances between reliable water sources stretched until the landscape between them became impassable for communities dependent on foot travel and animal herds. Migration became not a crisis response, but a structural condition built gradually into the logic of where and how people could live. This matters because it means the disappearance of the Green Sahara was not for its inhabitants a catastrophe in the way a flood or an earthquake is a catastrophe. It was a slow narrowing, experienced most likely as persistent difficulty rather than sudden loss, and survived at least initially through the accumulated adaptive intelligence of communities that had been reading environmental change for generations. The traces of that world and of its disappearance are distributed across an enormous area and encoded in disciplines that do not always speak to each other with ease: satellite remote sensing, paleoclimatology, archaeobotany, physical anthropology, oral tradition. Each field arrives at the same general period from a different angle. Each produces a partial image of something larger. What we are attempting tonight is to lay those images carefully alongside one another and ask whether held together they suggest a coherence that no single discipline can establish on its own. 3 traces run through what follows. The first is geological and hydrological. The buried river systems and vanished lake basins of the Sahara, the ghost hydrology that orbital radar is now beginning to map with genuine precision. The second is archaeological and astronomical, the physical sites where human communities left evidence not only of sustained presence but of deliberate, carefully maintained observation of the sky. The third is linguistic and cultural, the oral traditions preserved by communities who continued for thousands of years after the landscape transformed to describe in inherited stories a world that no longer surrounded them. A world of rivers, lakes, and rain that their descendants had never seen. Each trace has its own evidentiary weight, its own specific limitations, and its own particular kind of strangeness when examined closely. Taken in isolation, each is historically significant but interpretively contained. Taken together as a set of independent lines converging on the same question, they form something that is harder to hold at arm's length. Whether what they point toward constitutes a lost civilization, in the full sense a society with accumulated knowledge, symbolic systems and institutional memory capable of transmission across generations, the evidence is not yet decided. That question remains genuinely open in the scientific literature, contested not on ideological grounds, but on evidentiary ones. What the evidence has decided is simpler, and in its own way more interesting. The Sahara was full of people, and they left things behind. We begin with the water. The river state was less idmutchesevstastim. Stayed. In 2000, researchers processing radar data from NASA's Shuttle Radar Topography mission noticed something in the imagery from northwestern Africa that the ground surface gave no indication of whatsoever. Beneath the sand of the central and western Sahara, beneath, in some places, tens of meters of accumulated dune material, the radar returns were tracing the unmistakable signatures of river channel. Not small seasonal wadis, not isolated drainage features, but large branching integrated river systems of the kind that form only when sustained rainfall feeds a landscape over centuries. The channels had meanders, they had tributaries. They had floodplains of the width that only high-discharge rivers produce, and they extended in some cases for distances of several hundred kilometers, connecting the highland massifs of the interior to coastlines that had not received meaningful river flow in thousands of years. The rivers were gone, their shapes had remained. The largest of these buried systems is known today as the Wadi Taman Rasset, though the name belongs to a dry valley in the Algerian south, rather than to the full extent of the ancient drainage network the radar revealed. At its greatest extent, this system appears to have drained a basin of over 1 million square kilometers, a catchment area comparable to that of the modern Niger River, collecting rainfall from the Hogar Mountains of southern Algeria and routing it westward and southward across what is now the Sahara's most desolate interior, eventually reaching the Atlantic coast of Mauritania through a delta system that remains partially visible in submarine topography offshore. During the African humid period at its hydrological peak, this river may have carried discharge volumes comparable to the Mississippi. That figure is an estimate derived from channel geometry, not from direct measurement, and the uncertainty around it is real. But the channel geometry itself is not in dispute. The shape of the river is there readable by anyone with access to the radar data. What the radar cannot easily show is what lived along the banks of those rivers, and this is where the geological record requires archaeological supplementation. Field surveys conducted in the decades since the initial remote sensing discoveries have found scattered along the margins of the buried channels and in the sediment layers of the basins. They once fed a consistent pattern of human material stone tools of Herculean and later Eterian and Capsian typologies, or ceramic fragments in styles that cluster in the period between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 years before present grinding, stones, hearths, and at several locations, concentrations of faunal remains that indicate sustained occupation rather than brief passage. The communities that produced these materials were not camping beside the rivers in the way that a travelling group might pause at water for a night. The density and stratigraphic depth of the assemblages suggest people who had organised their lives around specific locations along the drainage network, returning to the same places across multiple seasons, across what may have been multiple generations. The most fully documented of these locations is Gobaro in the Tenere region of northern Niger, a site that would register today as one of the most inhospitable points in the entire Sahara. The site occupies what was 10,000 years ago the shoreline of a freshwater lake fed by the regional drainage system. Excavations led by paleontologist Paul Sereno between 2000 and 2006 recovered the skeletal remains of more than 200 individuals arranged in graves that showed consistent mortuary practice across at least two distinct cultural periods separated by a gap of several thousand years. The earlier group, designated the Kiffian, were physically large. Some individuals exceeded 6 feet in height, and their faunal assemblages indicate a community living substantially from freshwater fish and large game. The later group, the Tenerian, were more slightly built and showed evidence of cattle pastoralism. The same lakeside location used by two completely different communities across a span of occupation that brackets a period of regional desiccation in between. The lake dried. People left. The lake refilled centuries later and different people came. This pattern of interrupted occupation presence, absence presence, again recurs across the Saharan archaeological record with enough consistency to be more than coincidence. It maps onto what paleoclimatologists have reconstructed from sediment cores. The African humid period was not a single unbroken interval of moisture, but a series of wetter phases, until separated by the drier oscillations, each lasting decades to centuries. The human sites cluster in the wet phases and empty in the dry ones. The match between the climate proxy data and the archaeological distribution is close enough that researchers now use one to calibrate the other. When a new site is found and dated, it adds a data point to the climate reconstruction. When the climate model is refined, it suggests where undiscovered sites might be located. The largest body of water that the Green Sahara's drainage systems produced and sustained was Lake Mega Chad. At its maximum extent approximately 6,000 years ago, this inland sea covered an estimated 400,000 square kilometers, larger than the Caspian Sea, larger than all 5 of North America's Great Lakes combined. Its former shorelines are still visible in satellite imagery as pale curving ridges of consolidated sediment running across the landscape of modern Chad, Niger and Cameroon. The lake that occupies a fraction of that basin today, modern Lake Chad, fluctuates between roughly 1 and 2,000 square kilometers depending on annual rainfall less than 1% of its ancient predecessor's area. The transition between those two scales was not abrupt. The sediment record shows a prolonged recession, punctuated by partial recoveries unfolding across the same centuries during which the monsoon was gradually retreating southward. Beneath the Sahara, the memory of all this water has not entirely disappeared. The Nubian sandstone aquifer system, one of the largest known reserves of fresh water on the planet, extending beneath Egypt and Libya. Chad and Sudan holds water that isotope analysis dates to the last humid period. When wells tap it today, they draw up precipitation that fell as rain between 10,000 and 30,000 years ago, filtered down through the sand and stored in the porous rock beneath. It is fossil water in the most literal sense. Ancient rain, still liquid, still moving slowly through stone. Communities in the region have known about this water in a practical sense for as long as they have been digging wells. The science has only recently provided a date for how old it is. The buried rivers have shapes but no current. The vanished lake has shorelines but no surface. What remains is a landscape that holds the geometry of a living hydrology, without any of the life it once supported, and somewhere within that geometry the outline of a world that people inhabited for thousands of years before it dried around them. The second trace begins not underground, but on the surface of stone. What the stones were watching. The summer solstice in the latitude of southern Egypt arrives not with ceremony but with heat. The sun reaches its northernmost point on the horizon before dawn has finished establishing itself, and for anyone standing in the open desert the moment is legible primarily as the day the light comes earliest and stays longest, a fact that in a landscape governed entirely by the timing of seasonal rain carries the weight of survival. 7,000 years ago, a group of people living near a seasonal lake in what is now the western desert of Egypt mark that moment in stone. Not symbolically led, not approximately, but with a precision that researchers confirmed only by running the alignment calculations backward through 7 millennia of axial precession and checking the result against the horizon. The stones at Nabta Playa still point where they were aimed. The solstice still rises where the builders expected it to. Nabta Playa sits today in one of the most remote corners of the Egyptian Sahara, roughly 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, and several hundred kilometers from the nearest permanent settlement. The playa itself, a shallow, flat-bottomed basin, was during the African humid period a seasonal lake that filled each summer when the monsoon rains arrived from the south. The people who used the site were not permanent residents in the sense of year-round habitation. The evidence suggests seasonal aggregation communities converging on the lake when water was present and dispersing across the broader landscape during the dry months. But the material they left behind is inconsistent with purely transient activity. Excavations beginning in the 1970s under Fred Wendorf and later extended through the 1990s revealed not only hearths, cattle bones and ceramic assemblages, but a set of megalithic structures that had been planned, constructed, and critically maintained over what appears to have been a span of several centuries. The central calendar circle at Nabta Playa consists of a ring of sandstone slabs, the largest standing roughly a metre tall, arranged in a rough oval approximately 4 metres in diameter. Within and immediately surrounding this circle, additional stones were set in alignments that correspond to the summer solstice sunrise, and potentially to other astronomical events whose precise identification remains debated among researchers. What is not debated is the solstice alignment itself. The geometry is unambiguous when the horizon profile is correctly reconstructed. What is also notable and less frequently discussed is the effort the construction required. The stones used in the primary circle were not sourced from the immediate vicinity of the playa. The nearest outcrop of comparable material lies several kilometers away across open desert. Moving those stones to the site, setting them upright and maintaining their positions over multiple generations implied a community with both the organizational capacity and the motivation to invest sustained labour in something that produced no food, no shelter, and no material return, only knowledge. The knowledge of when the rain would come. Surrounding the calendar circle, further excavation revealed a series of larger megalithic alignments extending outward from the main site, some of which correspond to star positions as they appeared in the southern Egyptian sky between 6,000 and 7,000 years ago. The astronomer Kim Malville, who undertook detailed analysis of these secondary alignments in the 1990s, identified correspondences with bright stars, including those in Orion's belt, and with the star Arcturus correspondences that hold up within the margin of error introduced by stellar proper motion across the intervening millennia. Whether these alignments were intentional in an astronomical sense, or whether they represent something more ceremonial, whose relationship to the sky was indirect, is a question that the physical evidence cannot resolve. The alignments exist. Their relationship to stellar positions is real. The interpretation of what that relationship meant to the people who created it remains open. What the rock art of the Tasli Nadja, roughly 1,200 kilometers to the northwest, adds to this picture is not astronomical precision, but human scale, an image of what daily and ceremonial life in the green Sahara looked like from the inside. The Tasli Plateau in southeastern Algeria contains one of the largest concentrations of prehistoric rock art anywhere in the world, and its estimated 15,000 individual images covering canyon walls, rock shelters and open faces of sandstone across a plateau roughly the size of Switzerland. The images span a chronological range from approximately 10,000 years before present to the early historical period, and their subjects change across that span in ways that track the Sahara's climatic transformation with uncomfortable directness. The earliest layers are dominated by large wild animals, aurochs, elephant, hippopotamus, Barbary sheep rendered with an anatomical attention that suggests long familiarity rather than occasional encounter. The middle layers corresponding to the pastoral period of the African humid period's peak fill with cattle herds moving across implied grasslands, figures tending animals with rope, and staff calves depicted beside adults with the specificity of people who understood individual animals rather than abstract herds. The later layers introduce horses, then camels, the index fossils in a sense of a drying world animal, animals that succeed precisely where cattle cannot. Among the Tassili images, one figure has attracted sustained attention. A large humanoid form several meters tall on the rock face with what appears to be a rounded helmet or headdress, arms extended, smaller figures arranged around it in postures that suggest either veneration or dance. Popularly referred to as the Great Martian God in early literature, a label that reflects the interpretive anxieties of the mid-20th century more than anything the image itself requires. It is more carefully understood today as a representation of a ritual specialist or symbolic figure, possibly connected to rainmaking practices of the kind documented across sub-Saharan Africa into the historical period. The costume elements, the posture, and the compositional relationship between the central figure and the surrounding smaller ones all have analogues in documented ceremonial traditions. The image does not require exotic explanation. It requires only the acknowledgement that the people who made it had a symbolic vocabulary, a set of shared visual meanings, sophisticated enough to encode abstract social and cosmological relationships in painted form on a canyon wall where it has remained legible for 6,000 years. The calendar stones at Nabta Playa and the painted walls of Tassili Niger are separated by geography, by chronology, and by the disciplines primarily responsible for studying them. What connects them is simpler. Both are evidence of communities investing deliberate effort in the project of understanding their world, measuring it, depicting it, transmitting that understanding across time. The third trace moves in a different direction entirely into language and memory, where the evidence is older than any stone and far more difficult to verify. The memory that outlasted the water? Consider what it would take for knowledge to survive 10,000 years without writing. Not the knowledge encoded in stone alignments which survives passively requiring no active transmissions, just the continued existence of the stone. Verbal knowledge, the kind that lives in language, in story, in the specific words used to describe a place or a phenomenon. For that kind of knowledge to cross 10 millennia, it would need to be repeated with enough frequency and consistency to survive the deaths of every person who had ever heard it, the collapse or transformation of every social structure that once organized its transmission, the dispersal of communities across distances that severed almost every other form of continuity. It would need, in short, to be important enough that people kept saying it, even when the landscape it described had become unrecognizable, even when its referent had vanished so completely that the words themselves must have seemed like metaphor to the generations who inherited them. The question of whether any oral tradition from the Green Sahara has actually survived in this form is not one that archaeology or climate science can answer. It sits at the uncomfortable boundary between disciplines where the evidentiary standards of one field do not translate cleanly into the other. What can be documented is this across the communities that have historically inhabited the Saharan and sub-Saharan belt, Tuareg Berber, Tubu, Fulani and others. There exist oral traditions that describe with varying degrees of geographic specificity a landscape of rivers, lakes and perennial grasslands in regions that are now hyper-arid desert. These traditions were recorded by European travellers and colonial administrators beginning in the 19th century at a time when the people transmitting them had no access to geological or paleoclimatological research, and no particular reason to invent a greener past for their landscape. The descriptions are not vague. In several cases, Tuareg elders interviewed in the 20th century described the course of a subterranean river running beneath the central Algerian desert in terms that, when mapped against satellite radar data gathered decades later, corresponded with the buried trace of the Wadi Taman Rasset with a geographic precision that the interviewers had no way of anticipating. The river the elders described as sleeping beneath the sand is in fact beneath the sand. Its channel is there. The oral description and the radar image point to the same place. This kind of correspondence is the most disquieting aspect of the third trace, and disquieting is precisely the right word, not because it confirms anything, but because it resists the comfortable explanations in either direction. It is too specific. to dismiss as generic mythologizing about a weta, plus the kind of retrospective environmental nostalgia that could be generated independently by any community living in difficult conditions. But it is also far too isolated and too methodologically fraught to constitute evidence of continuous knowledge transmission from the African humid period. The gap between 10,000 years ago and the 19th century interviews is unbridged. There is no documented chain of transmission. There is only the correspondence between the description and the geology sitting in the record without an explanation that fully satisfies. The linguistic evidence is somewhat more tractable, though not by much. Across the Saharan and Sahelian regions, place names in Tuareg, Berber, Arabic and other languages render upon translation a consistent set of reference valley, spring, river, lake, rainwater source. These names attach to locations that are in their current form entirely waterless gravel plains, dry wadies, dune fields where no surface moisture has been recorded in the historical period. The interpretation that presents itself immediately is that the names are linguistic fossils preserving in phonological form the memory of a hydrology that no longer exists, and that interpretation may be correct. But it carries a complication that is worth sitting with carefully. We cannot easily distinguish a name that has been transmitted continuously from the period when the water existed from a name that was assigned more recently perhaps by a traveller or community who found an ancient dried riverbed and named it for what it obviously once was. The geological evidence of former water is visible in many cases on the surface in the smooth-worn stones of a dry channel in the salt crust of a former lake margin. A community does not need 10,000-year oral memory to look at a dry riverbed and call it by a word that means river. They need only eyes. The Zazura tradition complicates this further in a different direction. The legend of Zazura, a hidden city of white walls, running water and singing birds, said to lie somewhere in the Libyan or Egyptian desert, has been documented in Arabic sources since at least the 15th century and was actively sought by European explorers well into the 20th. For most of that time, it was treated as pure myth, the kind of mirage-born fantasy that desert travel predictably generates. When archaeological remote sensing began revealing buried settlement patterns in the regions where the legend placed Zazura, the relationship between the story and the physical record became harder to characterize simply. There are beneath the sand in those regions the remains of ancient settlements, not a single city, but distributed communities organized around water sources that dried thousands of years ago. Whether the Zazura legend preserves a memory of those settlements, or whether it is a later narrative that attached itself to the visible ruins that occasionally surface from the sand, is a question the evidence cannot resolve. Both explanations are archaeologically consistent. Neither can be ruled out. What makes the oral tradition trace genuinely complicated rather than simply uncertain in the ordinary way that all historical evidence is uncertain is that its unreliability cuts asymmetrically. If oral traditions about the Green Sahara are unreliable, they are unreliable in a way that is likely to understate rather than overstate the actual extent of human presence and cultural development in the region. Communities that were displaced, absorbed or extinguished by the desiccation process left no oral record at all. What survives is the testimony of those whose descendants continued, who maintained enough social continuity to preserve any transmission whatsoever. The silences in the oral record are not neutral. They are shaped by the same catastrophe that shaped the archaeological record, and they are at least as informative as the stories that made it through. 3 traces then, each partial, each pointing in roughly the same direction. What happens when they are placed beside one another is the subject of the next boom of man. 3 lines, 1 shape. The 3 traces examined so far were developed independently by different researchers working in different disciplines across different decades, and none of them was constructed with the others in mind. The radar geologists mapping buried river systems were not in the 1990s and early 2000s in conversation with the astronomers measuring stone alignments at Nabta Playa. The anthropologists recording Tuareg oral traditions in the mid-20th century had no access to the satellite imagery that would later corroborate some of what those traditions described. Each trace arrived at its conclusions through its own methodological pathway, constrained by its own evidentiary standards, and each is defensible or questionable on its own terms without reference to the others. This is precisely what makes the convergence worth examining carefully. When independent lines of inquiry point toward the same general conclusion, the explanation that each is simply wrong becomes progressively less economical without becoming impossible. The convergence is not perfect. It is not the kind of convergence that closes a question. What it produces when the three traces are placed alongside one another is something more like a coherent silhouette, a shape that multiple sources of light shining from different angles cast against the same surface. The shape is recognizable. It's the outline of a world in which sustained human communities occupied the green Sahara for thousands of years, developed observational and symbolic practices of considerable sophistication, and transmitted memory of that world forward in time through channels that were degraded but not entirely severed by the desiccation event that ended it. That outline is what the convergence produces. Whether anything more detailed can be resolved within it is a separate question. The most direct connection between the first and second traces runs through water and a knowledge simultaneously. Nabta Playa was not chosen arbitrarily as a ceremonial and astronomical site. It was a seasonal lake. The communities that aggregated there in the summer months did so because water existed there in the summer months, which is to say because the same monsoon system that fed the Wadi Teman Reset and its tributaries was also filling the Nabta Basin each year. The stone circle that tracked the summer solstice was built at the precise moment and location where the solstice mattered most, the point at which the monsoon's arrival could be anticipated, verified this, or in a year when it was late, worried about with the particular anxiety of people whose herds and stores depended on what the next weeks would bring. The astronomical knowledge encoded at Nabta Playa is not separable from the hydrological system that made Nabta Playa worth returning to. The water explains the site explains what the water meant. The connection between the first trace and the third is the one the Tuareg oral material makes explicit, and its specificity remains the most arresting single fact in this entire convergence. When elders described the course of the buried Taman Raset drainage system before its radar mapping, they were not describing a general tradition of a wetter past. They were describing the route, a specific path that water had taken through specific terrain in terms that, when checked against the radar data, were directionally accurate. That accuracy could have several explanations as noted in the previous chapter, and none of them can be eliminated with current evidence. But one of those explanations is that the knowledge was real and old and had been kept. If that explanation is correct, it means that some thread of transmitted memory connected communities living in the 20th century to communities who had watched those rivers run. Across 5,000 years of intervening desiccation, displacement, and cultural transformation, a description of a river's course survived in language. That is, if true, an extraordinary fact about human memory. It is also importantly a fact that the geological record makes testable in a way that most oral tradition claims are not. The river is either where the elders said it was, or it is not. It is. The connection between the second and third traces is more diffuse but not less interesting. The symbolic vocabulary visible in the Tassili Niger rock art, the cattle imagery, the ritual figures, the geometric patterns that recur across panels separated by centuries and hundreds of kilometers, has structural parallels in the ceremonial traditions of communities living today in the Sahel and West Africa, whose oral and ritual cultures were documented beginning in the 19th century. These parallels are not proof of direct descent. Parallel symbolic forms can develop independently, and the cattle symbolism visible in Tassili art is the kind of iconography that any pastoralist culture might generate without needing to inherit it from a predecessor. But the parallels exist in enough specific detail in compositional arrangements, in the relationship between human and bovine figures and ceremonial context, in the use of particular geometric motifs as boundary markers between representational zones, that researchers studying both the rock art and the living traditions have noted them with some consistency. Not proof, a pattern, the genetic evidence which sits somewhat outside all three traces, but intersects with all of them, adds a different kind of corroboration. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains from Gbero and other Saharan burial sites compared with remains from contemporaneous and slightly later Nile Valley populations shows dietary and mobility signatures consistent with westward migration, people moving from the Saharan interior toward the Nile as the desiccation advanced, carrying material, culture and biological heritage that shows up in the archaeological and physical anthropological record of early Egyptian communities. The Capsian bees shell ornaments recovered from North African sites that originated in coastal species whose nearest habitats were hundreds of kilometers from where the beads were found indicate exchange networks of considerable geographic reach operating across the Saharan interior during the humid period. These are not the material signatures of isolated, disconnected communities. They are the signatures of a networked world, one in which information objects and presumably knowledge moved across distances that the current landscape makes almost impossible to imagine as traversable. What the convergence produces then is not a lost civilization in the cinematic sense, no buried city of gold, no suppressed history of impossible achievement. It produces something stranger, and in some ways more demanding, the image of a populated, connected, observationally sophisticated human world occupying a landscape that no longer exists, leaving traces that are fragmentary. Not because the world was small, but because the process that ended it was thorough, and the disciplines studying it are young. The silhouette is real. The detail within it is what remains genuinely unresolved. And the most serious challenge to everything assembled so far has not yet been addressed, which is where we go next, what the skeptic holds. The archaeologist who has spent 3 field seasons excavating in the Saharan interior, sleeping in temperatures that drop 40 degrees between noon and midnight, watching carefully documented sites disappear under shifted dunes before the photography is complete, that person does not find the romantic version of this story particularly useful. Not because the evidence is uninteresting, but because the evidence is hard enough to read without the additional distortion introduced by the desire to find something extraordinary within it. The skeptical position on the Green Sahara's human record is not a failure of imagination. It is in several of its central arguments a disciplinary responsibility, and it deserves the same careful attention that the traces received in the preceding chapters. What it says stated plainly is this: the gap between what the evidence actually shows and what the more expansive interpretations claim it shows is wider than the enthusiasm of the convergence narrative acknowledges. The first and most structurally significant skeptical argument concerns the word civilization itself, the term that hovers over this entire episode without ever quite being defined. In the technical vocabulary of archaeology, civilization carries specific connotations: state level, social organization, a degree of economic specialization sufficient to support non-food producing classes, a system of record keeping or symbolic communication capable of transmitting complex information across generations without relying entirely on individual memory and material evidence of monumental investment architecture infrastructure, or artistic production at a scale that implies coordinated labor directed by some form of institutional authority. By these criteria, which are not arbitrary but have been developed precisely to distinguish between different levels of social complexity, what the Saharan archaeological record currently documents does not constitute civilization. It documents mobile and semi-sedentary pastoralist communities, hunter-fisher, gatherer groups, and the occasional evidence of seasonal aggregation at sites with reliable water. These communities were capable, adaptive, and at Nabta Playa, demonstrably capable of sustained astronomical observation. But capability is not the same as institutional complexity, and the absence of evidence for the latter is not simply a gap waiting to be filled, it may be an accurate reflection of what existed. The second skeptical argument addresses the Nabta Playa alignments directly, and it is worth hearing fully rather than dismissing. The solstice alignment at the central calendar circle is real on this point, there is no serious dispute. But the inference from a solstice-aligned stone circle to a sophisticated astronomical tradition, and from a sophisticated astronomical tradition to a proto-civilization with accumulated scientific knowledge, requires several steps that the evidence does not compel. Stone circles aligned to solstice points appear in numerous cultures at numerous periods and scales of social complexity, including contexts where there is no other evidence of the kind of institutional sophistication the Sahara interpretation sometimes implies. The effort required to build Nabta Playa moving stones several kilometers across desert terrain is consistent with the organizational capacity of a mid-sized Gyeokwot pastoralist community operating seasonally at a shared ceremonial site. It does not require a permanently settled population, a priestly class with specialized astronomical knowledge, or any of the social infrastructure that the more expansive readings of the site tend to invoke. The stones are remarkable. The social architecture required to produce them may have been considerably more modest than the interpretation suggests. The third argument is methodological, and in some ways it is the most difficult to answer, because it applies not to any specific claim, but to the entire evidentiary structure of the convergence narrative. Remote sensing data, the satellite radar that revealed the buried river systems, the infrared imagery that identified potential buried settlement patterns is a powerful tool for generating hypotheses. It is not a substitute for excavation. The rectangular anomalies in the Gil-Kabir plateau imagery that were described in an earlier chapter as suggestive of planned settlement layouts have not, as of current reporting, been excavated and confirmed as anthropogenic structures. Some similar anomalies identified through remote sensing in other arid regions have turned out on ground investigation to be geological features, fault expressions, basalt dike outcrops, deflation surfaces, where differential erosion has produced straight-edged forms without any human involvement. The correspondence between oral traditions and radar-mapped river courses is striking, but striking correspondences occur in large datasets without implying direct causal connection. Each of these points is fair, each of them matters, and this is not a rhetorical pivot designed to rescue a predetermined conclusion, but an honest accounting of what the skeptical position leaves unexplained. Each of these arguments has a remainder. The disciplinary definition of civilization, however carefully constructed, was developed primarily from the study of civilizations that left abundant durable material stone architecture, fired ceramics in large quantities written records. It was not developed with mobile pastoralist communities in mind, nor with the particular preservation conditions of a landscape that subsequently became one of the world's most active sand transport systems. The absence of evidence for institutional complexity in the Saharan record is real, but the conditions for preserving evidence of institutional complexity in the Saharan record are among the worst on the planet. These are not equivalent statements. The Naphtaliya argument that the effort required is consistent with a mid-sized pastoralist community is probably correct, and yet it does not explain why that community was motivated to maintain a solstice alignment across what the stratigraphic record suggests was multiple centuries of use, or what social mechanisms ensured the alignment's continuity across generations in the absence of written instruction. The methodological critique of remote sensing as hypothesis generation rather than confirmation is entirely valid, and it applies with full force to the more speculative buried city claims. It applies less cleanly to the Gabbero excavations, which were conducted through standard physical archaeology, produced radiocarbon dated Kui skeletal material, and are not remote sensing hypotheses in any sense. What the skeptical position does most usefully is constrain the shape of what can legitimately be claimed. The Green Sahara's human record does not support claims of a lost advanced civilization in the sense that phrase usually implies. It does support the claim of a populated, regionally networked, observationally capable human world occupying a landscape that no longer exists, leaving a fragmentary material record whose full extent remains genuinely unknown. The skeptic and the pattern are not in the end describing entirely different things. They are describing the same incomplete picture from different distances. What remains after the skeptical accounting is not nothing. It is something more carefully bounded, and the question of what that bounded something implies when examined, alongside everything that came after it, is where the next chapter begins. What survives the accounting? The skeptical position presented fairly in the preceding chapter does something useful that the convergence narrative on its own does not do. It establishes a flaw. Below that flaw, claims of advanced institutional civilization buried cities of significant scale, a proto-Egyptian state operating in the Saharan interior. The evidence does not currently reach, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that clearly. But a flaw is not a ceiling. What the skeptical accounting establishes, as unsupported, is not the same as the full extent of what the evidence supports, and the two are easily confused in the aftermath of a rigorous critique. When a strong argument dismantles an overclaim, it can create the impression that everything in the vicinity of that overclaim has been dismantled with it. The more careful operation is to identify precisely which claims survived the critique intact and ask what, if anything, they amount to when the inflated framing is removed. Several things survived. The burial record at Gabbero is not a remote sensing hypothesis and was not touched by the methodological arguments of Chapter 6. The site was excavated through standard physical archaeology. The remains were dated through radiocarbon analysis. The mortuary practices is documented there, the careful positioning of bodies, the evidence of grouped interment, the pollen signatures consistent with flower placement, are not interpretively dependent on any particular theory of Saharan social complexity. They document a community that treated its dead with deliberate, consistent practice, and that returned to the same location across multiple generations of use. What specific beliefs or social structures organized that practice the evidence cannot say. That the practice existed, and that it was sustained the evidence establishes without ambiguity. A community capable of sustained mortuary practice across multiple generations Moaidans is a community with some form of transmissible social norm. Not a civilization in the institutional sense, but not a loosely aggregated band either. The distinction matters, and the Gobro record sits clearly on the side of it that implies organised, persistent community life. The astronomical record at Nabta Playa also survived the skeptical accounting in its core form, even if the more expansive social inferences drawn from it did not. The solstice alignment is real. The effort required to produce it transporting stone several kilometres maintaining the circle across what stratigraphy suggests was centuries of use is real. The skeptical argument that this is consistent with a mid-sized pastoralist community is probably correct, and it appropriately deflates some of the grander claims made about the site. But consistent with is a deliberately limited formulation. The same evidence is also consistent with a community that had developed across generations a specific and carefully maintained body of knowledge about the relationship between celestial events and seasonal water availability knowledge that was important enough to institutionalize in stone precisely because it could not be allowed to depend on the memory of any single individual. The stones were the memory. That is not a trivial observation about a society's relationship to knowledge, even if it does not require a priesthood or a state to explain it. What the recovery after skepticism looks like in this case is a recalibration of scale rather than a retraction of substance. The Green Sahara's human record does not support a lost civilization. It supports something for which archaeology does not have a fully satisfactory term, a distributed, regionally connected human world operating across a vast landscape capable of sustained observation and deliberate knowledge, encoding and linked by exchanged networks that moved objects and presumably ideas across distances of several hundred kilometers. This is not nothing. In the period we are discussing, between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 years before present, it places the central Sahara among the more complex human environments on the planet, not because it exceeded what was happening in the Levant or the early Fertile Crescent, but because it was happening at all in a landscape whose current character makes habitation seem implausible. The most consequential claim that survives the skeptical accounting, and the one that connects most directly to what came after, is the migration thesis. The argument that the communities displaced by the Saharan desiccation carried their accumulated practices into the Nile Valley and contributed meaningfully to the conditions from which Egyptian civilization eventually emerged. This claim is testable in ways that many archaeological hypotheses are not, because the Nile Valley record is extensive, well dated, and rich enough to show cultural continuities and discontinuities with some precision. The evidence it offers is not unambiguous, but it leans in a consistent direction. Ceramic typologies from pre-dynastic Upper Egyptian sites show formal and stylistic continuities with assemblages from the Saharan interior dating to the humid period. The cattle symbolism that pervades early Egyptian religious iconography. Hathor as cow, the Apis bull, the association of bovine imagery with fertility and divine power, has its most direct antecedents not in the Nile Valley itself, but in the pastoral cultures whose rock art covers the Tassili and Fezzan plateaus. Isotopic analysis of human remains from pre-dynastic Egyptian sites indicates dietary profiles and mobility patterns consistent with communities whose recent ancestors had been moving across open terrain, rather than living in fixed riverine settlements. None of this proves that the Saharan communities were the architects of Egyptian civilization. The Nile Valley had its own indigenous development, its own Neolithic communities whose contributions to their eventual emergence of the pharaonic state were substantial and independent. What the evidence suggests is something more specific and more modest, that the desiccation of the Sahara produced a directional migration of communities carrying particular skills: cattle management, seasonal water tracking, astronomical timekeeping, the habit of marking sacred space with deliberately placed stone into a river valley that could sustain permanent settlement in a way their previous landscape no longer could. These skills did not create Egyptian civilization. They entered a context in which Egyptian civilization was becoming possible, and they became part of what it drew on. The difference between those two formulations is significant, and the evidence supports the second one without requiring the first. The floor established by the skeptic then holds, but what is built on that floor, the Gobero record, the Nabta, alignments. The migration continuities is not negligible. It is a picture of human life in a vanished landscape that was richer and more connected than the current desert gives any indication of, and whose disappearance set in motion a chain of consequences that included, at some remove, some of the most durable human constructions on the planet. The chain is long and several of its links are inferred rather than documented, but the beginning and the end of it are both visible in the record, and the distance between them is shorter than the sand that now fills the intervening space. What remains to examine is what happened in the middle, specifically what the Green Sahara's communities understood about the world they inhabited that did not survive the desiccation in material form but may have survived in another. The knowledge that had no writing. A shell bead recovered from a burial site in the Algerian Sahara, dated to approximately 8,000 years before present, came from a marine species whose nearest habitat was the Mediterranean coast, roughly 800 kilometers to the north. It was not unique in this respect. Similar beads from the same species and from Red Sea mollusks, whose habitat lay several hundred kilometers to the east, appear consistently in assemblages across the Saharan interior, dating to the humid period, distributed with a geographic spread that implies not casual drift, but active, repeated, purposeful movement of objects across the full width of the inhabited landscape. A single bead travelling 800 kilometres up at Orbis is an anomaly. Dozens of beads from multiple coastal species appearing at inland sites across several different regional cultures over a span of several thousand years is a network. The Green Sahara was not a collection of isolated communities separated by distance. It was a connected world, and the connections were maintained with enough regularity to move small non-essential objects whose value was evidently symbolic rather than nutritional or functional, across distances that would have required weeks of travel. This matters for understanding what kind of knowledge the Green Sahara's communities possessed, because exchange networks of this geographic extent do not sustain themselves through accident. They require at minimum shared conventions about value, an agreement between communities that a particular object is worth acquiring, transporting and offering. They require knowledge of routes of where water can be found along the way, of which communities along the path will receive a traveller and which will not. They require, in short, exactly the kind of accumulated environmental and social knowledge that does not leave obvious material traces, but whose existence is implied by the traces that do remain. The beads are in the record. The knowledge required to move them 800 kilometers through desert terrain is not directly preserved, but one is evidence of the other, and the relationship between them is not speculative, it is logically entailed. The specific environmental knowledge that Saharan communities must have possessed is worth attempting to reconstruct even partially, because it reframes the question of what was lost when the desiccation ended the humid period. The communities that survived and thrived in the Green Sahara for thousands of years were not simply fortunate beneficiaries of a wetter climate. They were sophisticated readers of a landscape that was, even at its most hospitable, not uniformly or reliably productive. The African humid period brought more rain to the Sahara, but not predictable rain distributed evenly across the entire region. Rainfall was seasonal, spatially variable, and subject to multi-year fluctuations that could render a previously reliable water source temporarily inaccessible. The communities that persisted across the full span of the humid period, not just during its peak centuries, but through the oscillations and partial dryings that preceded and followed the peak, were communities that had learned to read the landscape's signals with a precision that no individual lifetime of observation could produce. That precision was the product of accumulated transmitted knowledge, which dry season indicators predicted a good monsoon, which plant species appeared first at a recovering spring, which animal behaviours signalled where water could be found below the surface, which star positions correlated with the beginning of the rainy season, and which with its end. The Caucasus Mountains in southwestern Libya, less studied than the Tasli Najjer, but archaeologically rich in ways that complement the Algerian material, contain rock art panels that include, alongside the cattle herds and hunting scenes, common to the broader Saharan corpus, a category of image that has attracted less popular attention but considerable scholarly interest depictions of plants. Specific identifiable plant species rendered with enough botanical accuracy that researchers have been able to match them to known Sahelian flora appear in panels dated to the pastoral period at multiple sites in the Caucasus. The significance of this is not aesthetic. In a landscape where the difference between a toxic and an edible plant could determine survival, and where the distribution of particular species indicated the proximity and quality of water sources, botanical knowledge was practical knowledge of the highest order. The fact that plant images appear in the same visual tradition as ceremonial figures and astronomical markers suggests that botanical knowledge was considered important enough to encode in the shared symbolic vocabulary to be placed in the same register as the information about cattle and sky that the communities clearly regarded as worth preserving in durable form. The water reading knowledge in particular has a specific legacy that is traceable, if not definitively, into historical periods. The practice of identifying subsurface water through the observation of indicator plants, particular grass species, certain shrubs whose root systems reach groundwater, that surface observation does not reveal, is documented among Tuareg and Berber communities in the historical record described in enough technical detail by 19th and early 20th century observers to constitute a genuine body of systematic knowledge rather than folk belief. The specific plant species identified as water indicators in these historical accounts correspond in several cases to species whose pollen appears in Saharan sediment cores from the humid period. The plants were present then. The knowledge of their significance may have been accumulated, then refined over thousands of years of practical use and transmitted forward through the desiccation in the same channels, oral tradition, practical demonstration apprenticeship that carried other aspects of Saharan cultural knowledge into the historical period. This chain of inference has gaps, but it is not invented from nothing. What the exchange networks, the botanical knowledge, and the water reading traditions collectively describe is a community of people whose relationship to their environment was not passive or merely adaptive, but actively investigative. A sustained multi-generational project of understanding how a complex and variable landscape worked, encoding that understanding in transmissible form, and applying it to the practical problems of survival and exchange. This is knowledge production. It is not institutionalized in the way. Later literate civilizations institutionalize their knowledge in libraries or schools or written treatises. But it is not therefore less real or less sophisticated. It is differently organized, distributed across communities rather than concentrated in institutions, stored in practice and oral transmission rather than in text, and preserved not in libraries that can be excavated, but in behaviors and traditions that are legible, if at all only obliquely through the material record. The next chapter examines the single point in the entire Saharan records where that oblique legibility becomes briefly and strangely something closer to direct a set of details that no current explanation handles cleanly, and that the record has been quietly holding without resolution for longer than most researchers find comfortable. The details that hold no explanation. In 1958, a team excavating a rock shelter in the Uan Mahugiag Valley of the Libyan Caucasus Mountains unwrapped something that has not found a settled place in the Saharan record in the 60-plus years since. It was the mummy of a child approximately 18 months old at death, buried in a fetal position inside a leather pouch. Radiocarbon dating places the burial at approximately 5,500 years before present, roughly contemporary with the final centuries of the Green Sahara's inhabited period, when the desiccation was already advanced, but had not yet completed its transformation of the central Libyan landscape into the hyper-arid desert it is today. The mummification was not accidental. The child's internal organs had been removed, and the body cavity treated with a preservative substance. The soft tissue preservation that resulted was deliberate, systematic, and technically accomplished, and it predates the earliest documented examples of the intentional mummification in Egypt. A civilization whose mortuary practices are among the most extensively studied in the world by several centuries, possibly by more than 1,000 years, depending on which Egyptian examples are used as the comparison point. This fact has not generated the sustained research attention it probably deserves, partly because the Caucasus is remote and difficult to work in, and partly because a single example resists the kind of pattern-based analysis that archaeological argument typically requires. One mummy is an anomaly. It cannot by itself establish a tradition, but an anomaly is not nothing, particularly when it appears in a cultural and geographic context where the preconditions for the knowledge it implies are, as the preceding chapters have established, more substantial than the landscape's current emptiness suggests. Someone in the Caucasus 5,500 years ago knew how to remove organs from a body and treat the remaining tissue in a way that preserved it across 5.5 millennia of Saharan conditions. Where that knowledge came from, how it related to the mortuary practices documented at Gerbero several thousand years earlier, and what happened to it afterward, whether it was carried eastward during the desiccation migration, whether it reached the Nile Valley, and contributed to what eventually became one of history's most distinctive cultural practices, the record does not say. The child in the leather pouch is in the record. The explanation for how the knowledge that preserved that child was acquired and transmitted is not. The Tasli-Niger rock art examined in Chapter 3 primarily through its pastoral period imagery contains an earlier layer that is in some respects more difficult to categorize than anything the cattle paintings produce. Beneath the herding scenes, beneath the naturalistic animal imagery of the hunter period, there is a stratum of paintings, known informally as the Roundhead phase, dated tentatively to between 10,000 and 8,000 years before present, placing it at the very beginning of the African humid period, whose visual vocabulary is unlike anything that precedes or follows it in the Saharan corpus. The figures in these paintings have large circular featureless heads with no facial markers. They float in compositions that abandon the ground line perspective of both the earlier animal paintings and the later pastoral scenes. Some are enormous. The largest round head figure known measures several meters in height and dominates an entire rock face, while others appear in clusters of smaller forms arranged in configurations that suggest neither hunting nor herding, but something for which the art historical vocabulary of subsistence activity does not have a ready category. The roundhead figures are sometimes described as evidence of shamanic or trance-related imagery by analogy with similar visual traditions documented in southern African rock art, where the connection between altered states and specific visual motifs is more robustly established. That analogy may be correct. It may also be projection, the imposition of a framework developed for a different culture onto material that the framework does not actually fit. What can be said without invoking analogy is narrower but more honest. The Roundhead phase represents a distinct visual tradition concentrated at the beginning of the humid period with no clearly identified cultural antecedent and no direct stylistic descendant in the traditions that follow it. It appears in the record and then essentially stops appearing. What replaced it, the vivid naturalism of the hunter and pastoral periods, looks compositionally and in terms of subject matter like a different tradition entirely. The cattle burials at Nabta Playa form the third detail in this chapter, and they are in some ways the strangest of the three, because they are the most logistically inexplicable in practical terms. Beneath the surface of the Nabta Playa site, excavations revealed a series of stone-lined pits containing the remains of cattle, not slaughtered animals whose bones accumulated as food waste, but cattle apparently placed whole into constructed stone enclosures and covered with flat capstone slabs. The pits are distributed around the ceremonial core of the site. The cattle placed in them were adult animals. The stone construction is careful enough to qualify as architecture in a modest sense, shaped enclosures, not simply dug whole. The site as established in Chapter 3 was seasonally occupied. The communities that used it were not permanent residents of the Nabta Basin. They converged on it when the summer rains filled the lake and dispersed across the wider landscape during the dry months, which means that the cattle placed in those stone pits were transported to the site or were present at the site at the time of their death and were then buried with structural investment, rather than consumed in a location that for much of the year was unoccupied. The labour involved in constructing the stone enclosures was real. The animals interred were valuable in any pastoralist economy as breeding stock, as milk sources, as measures of social wealth. They were buried instead. The parallel that presents itself most immediately here is with the Heresau, the cattle symbolism of early Egyptian religion, with Hathor, with the Apis bull, with the complex of associations between bovine life and divine or cosmological power that runs through the earliest layers of Egyptian ceremonial practice. Whether the Nabta cattle burials stand in a direct ancestral relationship to Egyptian cattle symbolism, or whether both reflect a broader pastoralist reverence for cattle that was distributed across multiple cultures without requiring direct transmission, is a question the evidence cannot resolve. The parallel is real, the mechanism that produced it is unknown, and the cattle are in the ground at Nabta under the flat stone lids, in a desert that has not seen rain sufficient to fill the seasonal lake in 5,000 years. Not proof. A pattern, but a pattern that extends in this case, not just across geography, but across the boundary between a vanished world and a surviving one, between the sand and the stone temples that rose after it. And the persistence of that extension is what makes the ground here feel, however briefly, like it is holding more than it is willing to release. The three details examined in this chapter, the Yuan Muhugiag mummy, the round heap paintings, the Nabta cattle burials, share a common characteristic that distinguishes them from the traces examined earlier. The buried rivers are explained in their basic form by hydrology. The stone alignments are explained in their basic form by the practical need to track seasonal water arrival. The oral traditions are explained, however imperfectly, by the psychology of cultural memory under conditions of environmental loss. These three details are not explained in their basic form by anything. They sit in the record without a framework that fully accounts for them, and they have been sitting there in some cases for more than 60 years of sustained archaeological attention without that situation materially changing. What follows from this observation is not a conclusion. It's the beginning of a different kind of looking one that does not move toward resolution but away from it toward the larger shape of what has been assembled here, and what it might mean to hold that shape without requiring it to become an answer. The landscape from a distance. Pull back far enough from any body of evidence and it stops looking like evidence. The individual data points, a radiocarbon date, a stone alignment, a marine shell, 800 kilometers from the coast, a mummified child in a leather pouch lose their discrete edges and begin to read as features of a single terrain. This is not a failure of analytical rigor. It's a different kind of looking one that becomes necessary at a certain scale when the accumulation of specific facts has reached the point where their relationship to one another carries more information than any single fact carries alone. What the Green Sahara's record looks like from that distance is what this chapter attempts to describe, and not as a list of findings, not as an argument for or against any particular interpretation, but as a landscape with its own topography, its own patterns of light and shadow, its own features that stand out and others that recede depending on the angle of approach. The first thing visible from this distance is the sheer duration of the human presence the record documents. The African humid period lasted approximately 9,000 years. For context, the entire span of recorded human history, from the earliest Mesopotamian writing to the present, covers roughly 5,000 years. The communities that inhabited the Green Sahara during its humid phase occupied that landscape for nearly twice the length of everything we conventionally call history across a geographic area larger than the contiguous United States. The traces they left are fragmentary, yes, degraded by desiccation, buried under sand, scattered across a region that remains among the least archaeologically surveyed on the planet. But the duration of their presence means that the fragmentation of the record is not evidence of the fragmentation of the world it records. A 9,000-year human presence in a landscape the size of a continent does not leave behind nothing. It leaves behind exactly what we are finding, distributed partial inconsistent evidence of communities that were numerous enough and persistent enough to leave traces across an enormous area, without being concentrated enough in any single location to leave the kind of dense layered record that survives obvious discovery. The second feature visible from this distance is the consistency of the adaptive signature across the full temporal span. The earliest Saharan communities of the humid period and the latest ones, separated by several thousand years by climatic oscillations, significant enough to depopulate entire lake basins and repopulate them with culturally distinct groups, show a persistent pattern of behavior movement, organized around water, symbolic investment in locations of seasonal aggregation exchange networks maintaining connections across geographic distances that subsistence logic alone does not require. This consistency across time is not what you would expect from isolated communities responding independently to local conditions. It looks from a distance more like the persistence of a cultural logic, a set of orientations toward landscape water and collective life, that was robust enough to survive the disruptions that periodically emptied specific locations and rebuilt itself recognizably when conditions allowed. The Kifian at Gobero and the Tenerian who followed them centuries later after the lake refilled were not the same people and did not share a continuous cultural tradition in any direct sense, but they made comparable choices about where to live, how to bury their dead, and what materials to invest in decorating. The landscape taught the same lessons to both. The third feature is the one that becomes visible only at this distance, because it requires the full geographic scope of the record to perceive the Green Sahara's communities were not on the periphery of the human world of their time. They were in terms of the land area they occupied, and the climatic resources available to them during the humid peak among the most favourably situated human populations on the planet. The Fertile Crescent was developing its agricultural traditions during the same period. Early communities in the Indus Valley were beginning the processes that would eventually produce one of the ancient world's great urban civilizations. The Green Sahara's inhabitants were contemporaneous with all of this, occupying a landscape of comparable or great productive potential connected by exchange networks that demonstrate awareness of distant communities and the capacity to maintain relationships with them. They were not primitive predecessors to the civilizations that came later. They were participants in the same broad human moment, differently situated, differently resourced, and as it turned out differently vulnerable to the specific catastrophe that ended their world. That vulnerability is the shadow that falls across this landscape from every angle. The Green Sahara's communities were exquisitely adapted to a set of conditions that were on the timescale of human cultural transmission temporary. The knowledge they accumulated about water, about seasonal movement, about the relationship between celestial events and terrestrial conditions was calibrated to a landscape that was already imperceptibly in the process of withdrawing. The sophistication of their adaptation was inseparable from its fragility. When the monsoon retreated and the lakes shrank and the distances between reliable water sources grew beyond the range of the exchange networks that had sustained connection across the interior, the specific knowledge that had made the Green Sahara's world coherent became progressively less applicable. Some of it transferred to the Nile Valley, to the Sahel margins, to the oasis communities that persisted in the drying interior. Some of it did not transfer because the landscape it described no longer existed anywhere, and the communities that held it dispersed beyond the reach of any transmission network that could keep it coherent. This is not unusual in human history. It is in fact the ordinary fate of specialized knowledge when the conditions that made it valuable disappear. What is unusual is the scale, the breadth of the world that was lost, and the completeness with which the sand covered its traces. The Rishat structure in Mauritania, the great concentric formation visible from orbit 50 kilometers across, whose geological explanation as an eroded dome is well established, and uncontroversial sites at the western edge of the region, where the Wadi Taman Reset drainage system once reached the Atlantic. It is not, as some popular accounts have claimed, a remnant of human construction. It is not Atlantis or a crater or anything other than what the geology says it is. But it is visible from space, and it is located at the convergence of an ancient river system and an ancient coastline in a region where human communities lived for thousands of years during the humid period. From orbit it looks like an eye. The metaphor is too easy to use seriously, and yet the coincidence of its location at the edge of the world, the buried rivers once watered staring upward from the sand, has a quality that the strict accounting of Chapter 6 does not quite neutralize. Not every coincidence is a pattern. Not every pattern is a fact, but the landscape viewed from sufficient distance holds both the documented and the unexplained, the measured and the merely noticed, without requiring either to become the other, and is in that held space between what is known and what the evidence keeps gesturing toward without resolving that the final movement of this episode begins its long, slow descent. What the desert teaches about time. The furthest thing archaeology can reach is not the oldest artifact. It is the moment when a specific human choice becomes visible in the material record, the decision to bury a child, with flowers to carry a shell 800 kilometers from the sea, to move a stone several kilometers across open desert and set it upright in alignment with a horizon that would matter again next summer. Each of those moments represents the intersection of a particular person or a particular community, with a particular understanding of what was worth doing. The material trace survives. The understanding that produced it does not survive directly, only its effects preserved in stone and bone and sediment, waiting for the instruments and the patience required to read them. This is what archaeology is at its most fundamental. The study of decisions whose makers are gone through the objects those decisions left behind. It is by its nature an incomplete science, and the incompleteness is not a flaw to be corrected by better methods or more excavations. It is structural. The gap between the object and the intention that produced it cannot be closed. It can only be acknowledged and held and worked with honestly. What the Saharan record adds to this ordinary incompleteness is a spatial and temporal scale that transforms the epistemological problem into something that begins to feel less like a research challenge and more like a philosophical condition. 9,000 years of human presence across 9 million square kilometers, preserved in fragments distributed across terrain that is actively hostile to the people trying to recover them. This is not a gap in the record that more fieldwork will eventually fill. It is the record. The fragments are not a reduced version of something more complete that once existed and was subsequently destroyed. They are what remains of a world whose full extent was never going to be legible from the outside because the people who inhabited it did not organize their knowledge in forms designed for external recovery. They organized it in forms designed for internal use in practice, in memory, in the bodies and voices of people who are gone in the landscape itself, which is also now gone. This is where the inquiry that began with buried rivers and stone alignments arrives, eventually at something that the vocabulary of evidence and counter-evidence is not quite adequate to hold. The Green Sahara was a world, not a precursor to a world, not a rehearsal for the civilizations that came later, not a primitive stage in a developmental sequence that culminates in writing and cities and institutional complexity. A world complete in itself, organized around its own logic, capable of sustaining human life and meaning and connection across a span of time that dwarfs everything that came after it and left monuments. The fact that we cannot fully recover that world does not mean it was smaller or less real than the worlds we can recover. It means the sand was as thorough and the disciplines that might have preserved more of it. Writing stone architecture-fired administrative records were either absent or have not survived in recoverable form. The absence of those preservation mechanisms is not evidence of a simpler world. It is evidence of a different one. The Milankovitch cycles that ended the African humid period are still running. The orbital mechanics that brought the monsoon northward into the Sahara and in 9,000 years ago, and withdrew it 5,000 years ago, are not finished. The same slow procession that greened the desert and then dried it continues on its 21,000-year rhythm, indifferent to everything that has happened on the surface since the last cycle completed. In approximately 10 to 15,000 years, a span roughly equivalent to the entire distance between us and the first settlements at Gobro, the Northern Hemisphere's summer insolation will increase again to the threshold required to push the monsoon back across the 20th parallel. The lakes will begin to refill. The buried rivers will in some places find their channels again. The seeds of plants adapted to wetter conditions dormant in the soil beneath the dunes will germinate, and the question of what returns to that landscape and what it knows or does not know about what was there before is a question that no one currently alive will be present to investigate. We will not resolve this tonight, and we will not resolve it in any night to come within the reach of any imagination currently operating. The Sahara will green again in its own time without reference to our curiosity about it. There is something stabilizing in that fact if it is approached without urgency. The planet's cycles are longer than civilizations. They are longer than the memory of civilizations. They are longer than the sediment layers that preserve the memory of civilizations. The 5,000 years between the end of the Green Sahara and the present moment during which Egypt rose and fell, Mesopotamia rose and fell, Rome rose and fell, and the entire apparatus of recorded human history accumulated is on the scale of Milankovitch cycles a rounding error. The sand that covers the buried rivers has been there in geological terms for an eye blink. The rivers have been absent for less time proportionally than a held breath. What this suggests about the permanence of any particular configuration of the world, including the one currently in operation, is left to the listener to consider at whatever depth the hour and the darkness permit. The last image this episode offers is smaller than cosmology and older than philosophy, and it waits in the next chapter in the precise stillness of a specific place holding what the larger view cannot quite contain. The child in the leather pouch, the Uan Mahugiag Valley in the Libyan Akakos, does not look in photographs taken during its brief archaeological seasons like a place that holds anything. The rock faces are pale ochre, weathered into shallow overhangs by the same wind erosion that has been working on them for millions of years. The valley floor is sand and gravel, unremarkable in the way that most of the Saharan interior is unremarkable, which is to say profoundly in a way that the eye cannot easily resolve into features or landmarks. There are no signs indicating what was found here. There is no preservation infrastructure, no interpretive panel, no fence marking the boundary of a protected site. The valley looks the way it looked before anyone knew to look at it carefully, and it will look the same after the last researcher who studied it is gone. The desert does not commemorate, it simply continues. Somewhere in the sediment of a rock shelter in that valley, in the early summer of 1958, a researcher's brush uncovered the outline of a leather pouch. Inside it, curled in the position of sleep or of pre-birth, was a child who had been placed there 5,500 years ago by people who understood something about preservation that the rest of the world would not document for another 1,000 years, give or take the uncertainties in the dating. The organs had been removed, the cavity had been treated, the pouch had been closed, and then whether through intention or through the particular mercy of the Saharan desiccation that was by that point already well advanced in the Akakos region, the child had remained, not as bone, as form, as the shape of a body that someone had decided was worth keeping in the world in a way that simple burial in the ground would not accomplish. We do not know the child's name. We do not know the name of the community that produced the knowledge required to preserve that body. We do not know whether the technique was inherited from a longer tradition or developed in response to a specific need in a specific season by a specific person whose understanding of what the body required in death exceeded anything we can confidently attribute to a broader cultural practice on the basis of a single example. We do not know whether this knowledge travelled east with the communities that migrated toward the Nile, as the Akakis dried around them, whether it arrived in the Nile Valley and became over generations of refinement and elaboration, one thread in the complex of practices that eventually produced the mortuary traditions of pharaonic Egypt. The connection is possible. It is consistent with the migration evidence. It cannot be confirmed, and the single example at Uamuhugiag is not sufficient to build a causal argument on however suggestive the chronology appears. What can be said and what is enough is simpler. Someone made a decision. In a landscape that was drying, in a community that was almost certainly already beginning to feel the long pressure of the retreating monsoon, the shortening of the wet season, the earlier arrival of the dry winds, the lakes that needed more weeks to fill each year and emptied faster, someone decided that a child who had lived for 18 months deserved to remain in the world in a form that went beyond the ordinary return to soil. The decision required knowledge. It required effort. It required, at some level, a belief that the form of a person carried meaning that outlasted the functions of a living body, a belief about what the dead were owed, about what it meant to have existed, about the relationship between the living and those who were gone. None of that belief is recoverable in its specific content. All of it is implied by the object it produced, which has now been in the world for 5,500 years, and which spent most of those years in the dark of a Saharan rock shelter, while the desert settled around it and the civilization that built the pyramids rose and fell and was rediscovered and became history. The leather pouch is in a museum in Rome. The child is still curled inside it in the position that was chosen 5,500 years ago by hands that have returned to the earth of a landscape that no longer resembles itself. Outside the museum, the city moves at its ordinary pace. The light in the streets changes with the hour gold in the afternoon grey in the evening, the particular blue of late night when traffic has thinned and the stones of the old buildings hold the warmth of the day and release it slowly into the air. Somewhere much further south, the Sahara is doing what it has always done, moving slowly, grain by grain, the way that something moves when it has all the time that exists and no particular direction to go. The buried rivers are in their channels. The stone circle at Nabta Playa is in its alignment. The roundhead figures are on their canyon walls in the dark where no light currently reaches them, patient in the way that only painted stone can be patient. And the child is in Rome in the pouch in the fetal position held across 5 millennia by the particular care of people whose names the sand has kept. The sand keeps everything eventually. It is not cruel in this. It is only thorough and very old and not finished. Whatever it holds that we have not yet thought to look for is still there under the dunes in the dark, waiting in the way that things wait when they have nowhere else to be. The desert is still dreaming, and so now are you. Rest now, traveller. A pollen grain does not travel far on its own. This is where the episode began, with that small fact, with the image of fossilized fig pollen in a sediment core from the central Sahara, and what its presence implied about the world that once surrounded the plant that made it. It seems appropriate to return to it now, not because it resolves anything that was opened in the hours since, but because it is in its smallness precisely the right scale at which to leave this material. Not the buried rivers, not the orbital mechanics, not the mummified child or the painted canyon walls or the stone scale circle still holding its solstice alignment in the empty desert. A single grain of pollen carried a short distance by a wind that blew 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, settling into the sediment of a lake that has since evaporated, completely preserved there. By conditions it had no awareness of, recovered. By an instrument it could not have anticipated, read by people trying to understand a world they were not there to see. That is the whole of the enterprise held in something smaller than the period at the end of this sentence. The uncertainty that accumulated across this episode is not a problem to be resolved before sleep. It is in a certain light the most honest thing the record produces, not confusion, not failure of analysis, but an accurate reflection of what it means to look at a world across 5,000 years of sand and silence and ask what it was like to live there. The fragments that survive are real. The gaps between them are also real. Both are part of the picture, and the picture does not resolve into a clean answer about whether the Green Sahara harboured something that deserves the word civilization, about whether the knowledge encoded in stone at Nabta Playa travelled east and became part of what built the temples on the Nile, about whether the oral traditions describing a buried river are the last audible echo of a world that ended 5 millennia ago, or a more recent inference dressed in ancient language. These questions have been held carefully tonight, not because the holding produces resolution, but because some questions are more honestly kept open than closed. The record is what it is, the sand kept what it kept. What lies beneath the portions that have not yet been surveyed, in the vast unexcavated interior of a desert the size of a continent, belongs to the future's curiosity rather than ours. History at this scale is not a story with a beginning and an end. It is a series of layers, most of them compressed into illegibility, occasionally interrupted by a fragment that the conditions of preservation decided to keep. The people who lived in the Green Sahara were not waiting to become history. They were living, tracking water, moving through landscapes that no longer exist, deciding what their dead deserved painting, what they saw and what they believed on the walls of canyons that are now silent in the deep Algerian interior, that life was complete in itself. It did not need to survive in the forms we can read for it to have been real or important or full of the particular texture of days that we would recognize in their small details as similar to our own. There is one question this episode did not ask directly, and perhaps it is the right one to carry into sleep. Not what the Green Sahara was, but what it felt like to watch it go. To be the generation that noticed the lake taking longer to fill. To be the children of people who had never known the lake to be absent, standing at its shrinking shore, looking at a horizon that was already grain by grain, beginning to shift towards something unrecognizable. That grief. If it was grief, that slow adjustment to a world withdrawing is not in the record. It is in the silence between the data points, in the gap between one occupation layer and the next, in the absence that the sand eventually produced. It is the part of the story that no instrument has yet learned to read. The desert is still there, still moving in its slow way, the dunes reshaping overnight, the buried channels holding their geometry in the dark beneath. The pollen is still in the sediment cores in the freezers of research institutions in Cairo and London and Chicago, waiting for the next question someone thinks to ask of it. The child is still in Rome. The stones at Nabta Playa are still in their alignment under whatever sky tonight has given the western desert. Let the distance between here and there be for now a restful one. Let the sand cover what it covers. Let the buried rivers keep their courses and the dark patient in the way that water, even absent water, remains patient in the shape it once carved. Let the question settle not into answers, but into the particular quiet that comes after a long and careful looking, the kind of quiet that does not demand resolution, that is content for the length of a night to simply hold what it has found and rest inside the not yet knowing. The desert breathes slowly, so now do you. Rest now, traveller.